The Gulf of Oman is where the Persian Gulf ends and the Indian Ocean begins. The point at which the bottleneck geometry of the Strait of Hormuz opens into deep water and the strategic calculus of Iranian naval power shifts from the confined denial operations of the Northern Gulf to something qualitatively different. In the Northern Gulf, Iranian naval doctrine exploits the geometry of narrow water, mines and fast attack craft and coastal missiles in a space so constrained that even a superior naval force cannot easily bring its advantages to bear. In the Gulf of Oman, the geometry changes. Deep water, open ocean, the approaches to 3 continents. A naval capability that operates in that environment is not a denial capability. It is a projection capability. The ability to threaten targets across a maritime radius that the Northern Gulf's confined geometry does not permit. The Iranian military had been developing that projection capability for 11 years by the time the target folder reached the confidence threshold required for a targeting decision. Not through surface vessels, whose vulnerability to air power had been demonstrated repeatedly in regional conflicts. Through the specific weapon category that combines the concealment advantage of a submarine launch platform with the precision of a ballistic guidance system, sea-launched ballistic missiles. The facility that the target folder described was the production plant for those weapons, buried in the coastal highlands 8 kilometers north of Jask, at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman. Positioned where the finished weapons it produced could be moved to the operational units that would employ them against the deep water targets that the Gulf of Oman's open geometry placed within range. The facility was not merely an assembly line. It was an integrated manufacturing complex reflecting a strategic decision to build domestic production capability for every component: guidance units, propulsion stages, reentry vehicle structures, fusing systems, all within the same underground footprint. The integration was a strategic asset, and the characteristic that made the target's elimination set the program back by years rather than months. Rebuilding an integrated domestic industrial chain that took 11 years to assemble requires rebuilding every element of it, not replacing a component available elsewhere. The primary production chambers sat at 55 meters, below the water table fluctuation zone that seasonal rainfall created in the upper rock layer and that would have compromised the precision manufacturing environment guidance component production required, and exceeding the penetration capability of every weapon in the Iranian inventory. The Makran limestone was dense, well cemented, and consistent. The weapons engineers assessed the fusing solution at 86% confidence. 14% was documented. The mission was authorized. The Jask region presented an air defense architecture whose character was shaped by its dual identity. A coastal zone at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman, where the Iranian Navy and IRGC Navy maintained overlapping patrol responsibilities, and a strategic production site whose value justified a protection architecture that extended beyond the standard naval base coverage. The long-range coverage came from 2 systems whose positions the collection had characterized. The first was an S-300PMU-2 battery positioned on the high ground 15 kilometers northwest of the facility, the dominant long-range system in the sector, oriented to cover the western approaches from the Strait of Hormuz direction. The second was a Bavar-373 battery, positioned on the coastal ridge south of the facility, covering the seaward approach from the Gulf of Oman, the direction from which a carrier-based strike package would approach. The 2 systems created overlapping long-range coverage that the approach geometry of any conventional strike package from either the Gulf or the Gulf of Oman would need to penetrate. The mission's approach was from neither direction. It was from the northeast, an approach that placed both systems in their least sensitive sectors simultaneously, exploiting a coverage geometry that the Iranian defense planners had not fully characterized as a vulnerability because no weapon system available to adversaries at the time of the facility's construction had been capable of approaching from that direction without transiting the airspace of a third nation. The mission was transiting the airspace of a third nation. The diplomatic arrangements supporting that transit will not be described here. The inner ring defense consisted of a Tor M1 battery positioned at the facility's surface access compound and a second Tor M1 battery 3 kilometers east on the coastal ridge, covering the approach vector from the Oman coast direction. A Pantsir S-1 was deployed at the Naval Coordination Post adjacent to the facility's primary logistics entry point, a position that the imagery had established as a recent addition dated to the preceding 8 months and assessed as a direct response to the Iranian military's internal threat assessment that the facility's growing strategic significance warranted enhanced point defense coverage. The Pantsir's deployment was in the target folder. It was in the EW allocation. The allocation had been sized against the Pantsir's position as determined by the most recent imagery pass, a pass conducted 11 days before the mission. The B-2 Spirit assigned to the mission lifted off at 9:44 p.m. The routing required 11 hours and 37 minutes via the northeast corridor, a route that placed both the S-300PMU-2 and the Bavar-373 in their least sensitive sectors simultaneously. The EW package was sized against full battery capabilities regardless, because treating favorable geometry as sufficiency rather than margin was a planning error the series had never made. The reduced sector geometry was additional protection on top of the suppression. The tanker contact at 1:51 a.m. completed in 15 minutes over the northern Arabian Sea. The pilot accomplished the connection on the first attempt in conditions that offered a moderate crosswind component that added precision to the required station keeping without creating the kind of oscillatory dynamics that a stronger crosswind would have produced. 14 minutes of fuel transfer. The tanker departed. The aircraft continued southwest. The EW package activated at 8:22 a.m. local time, 41 minutes before the planned initial point. The activation against both long-range systems and the inner ring was simultaneous, a departure from the standard sequential activation approach that the series had used in previous missions, driven by the assessment that the Jask sector's overlapping coverage architecture made sequential activation less effective than simultaneous suppression. Simultaneous activation required larger total power output from the EW package, but provided a cleaner suppression picture from the first moment of activation. The Growler flights from the carrier group in the Arabian Sea provided the S-300PMU-2 and Bavar-373 suppression. The land-based EW asset from the Gulf Partner airfield covered the inner ring. Both activated at 8:22 a.m. Both suppression pictures confirmed as effective within 90 seconds of activation. The Iranian sector response was different from previous activations in the series. Simultaneous multi-system jamming across all frequency bands created a sector-wide electromagnetic event that the Jask sector controller correctly characterized as qualitatively different from proficiency exercises. Those suppress individual system types on rotation. What happened at 8:22 a.m. was every system in the sector simultaneously jammed. He issued an active sector alert at 8:24 a.m., 2 minutes from activation to alert, the fastest response in the series. The active alert elevated all systems to active search mode and authorized fire control radar activation on any contact above the reduced threshold that active alert protocols permitted. Fire control radar activations reached the B-2's passive warning receiver at 8:26 a.m., The S-300PMU-2 fire control radar was up. The Bavar-373 fire control radar was up. The Tor-M1 batteries were in active search. The mission commander saw the display populate in the 2 seconds it took for the emissions to reach the aircraft's antenna array. Full sector in active fire control mode. 35 minutes from the initial point. He assessed the display with the specific speed that 35 minutes of remaining flight time and a full active fire control picture demanded. The S-300PMU-2 and Bavar-373 fire control radars were under growler suppression at the effectiveness levels the planning had established. Both systems' fire control pictures were degraded. Neither was generating clean track solutions from a heavily jammed environment. The inner ring Tor-M1 batteries were in active search under land-based EW suppression. The Pantsir at the Naval Coordination Post was active on its search frequency. He noted the Pantsir's frequency. He cross-referenced it against the EW allocation. The Pantsir's search frequency was being covered by the land-based asset's inner ring allocation at 74% effectiveness, below the 90% that the planning had established as the minimum acceptable threshold for the Pantsir's suppression. 74%. He queried the planning element through the data link. Pantsir suppression status. The response arrived in 40 seconds. The Pantsir had been repositioned from its characterized position since the last imagery pass. Its new position, determined in real time from the passive emission geolocalization that the signals intelligence platform was performing as the mission executed, was 1.6 kilometers north of the position the imagery had established 11 days earlier. 1.6 kilometers north placed it at a slightly different angle to the land-based EW assets allocation geometry, producing the coverage degradation that the 74% figure reflected. The Pantsir had been repositioned. The EW allocation had been built against its previous position. The mission commander transmitted the reallocation request to the land-based EW asset. Shift coverage to the Pantsir's actual current position. The asset received the request and began the geometric reallocation at 8:31 a.m. The reallocation would reach effectiveness in 7 seconds. At 8:31 a.m. and 4 seconds, 3 seconds into the reallocation, the repositioned Pantsir produced a return on its search radar at 28% detection confidence, below threshold. The operator noted it. The reallocation reached full effectiveness at 8:31 a.m. and 7 seconds. The next sweep produced nothing above the noise floor. The operator's 28% return had appeared and disappeared in the interval between the reallocation request and its implementation. He logged it as a probable jamming artifact and continued his scan. He had not reported it. The single below-threshold return in a jammed environment, disappearing on the next sweep, had not crossed his personal reporting threshold even under the active alert's reduced standards. The reallocation had taken 7 seconds. The Pantsir had produced 1 unreported return in the first 4 of them. The mission continued. The active sector alert was producing a response pattern that the mission commander was monitoring through the data link's real-time intelligence feed. The Jask sector controller had contacted the Regional Air Defense Command Authority and was requesting additional assets. The request had been transmitted at 8:29 a.m. A response was being prepared. The additional asset whose deployment was being prepared was an airborne radar platform, a Simorgh early warning aircraft that the Iranian Air Force had been operating from Bandar Abbas. That would, if launched and deployed on the Jask sector bearing, provide an airborne radar picture that was not susceptible to the ground-based jamming the EW package was maintaining. An airborne radar platform would see through the jamming that was blinding the ground systems. It would see through it because the jamming was geometry dependent. The growlers were jamming the ground-based radars from angles optimized for surface systems. An airborne platform at altitude would receive the radar returns from a different geometry, outside the optimized jamming cone. The Simorgh's deployment was the mission's existential threat, and the mission commander knew it the moment the intelligence feed showed the deployment request at 8:29 a.m. He had 26 minutes to the initial point. The Simorgh required between 15 and 25 minutes from scramble order to achieving an effective airborne radar picture over the Jask sector. A timeline the collection had established from observed operational patterns. If the deployment order was issued immediately and the aircraft launched at its minimum scramble time, it could achieve an effective picture inside his weapon employment window. If the deployment order was delayed, or if the scramble time was at its maximum, the aircraft would not achieve an effective picture before the weapons were released and the mission was complete. He transmitted the intelligence feed observation to the planning element with a priority indicator. The planning element's response came at 8:33 a.m. Regional Command had received the Jask sector controller's request and was evaluating it. Evaluating, not authorizing. The evaluation created a delay whose duration the planning element could not predict. Every minute the evaluation continued was a minute that moved the Simorgh's potential picture achievement time further past the weapon's employment window. He flew toward the initial point and watched the intelligence feed. The deployment authorization came at 8:39 a.m., 10 minutes after the request, 6 minutes after the planning element's observation of the evaluation status. 6 minutes of evaluation delay. The Simorgh's scramble was ordered at 8:39 a.m. Its minimum scramble time was 15 minutes. The initial point was at 9:03 a.m., 24 minutes from the scramble order. The Simorgh would achieve its effective airborne picture at the earliest at 8:54 a.m., 9 minutes before the initial point, 9 minutes of potential airborne radar coverage before the initial point. The mission commander calculated the engagement geometry. The Simorgh, achieving its picture at 8:54 a.m., would need to develop a track, pass it to the ground-based engagement systems, and those systems would need to execute an engagement, a sequence that the collection's operational pattern, data placed at a minimum of 4 minutes from airborne picture acquisition to weapons release authorization. 9 minutes of coverage minus 4 minutes of engagement sequence left 5 minutes of potential intercept window before the initial point. He had 24 minutes to the initial point when the scramble order was issued. He now had a potential intercept window in the final 5 minutes of that 24. He transmitted the Simorgh scramble alert to the Growler flight with the priority code that authorized the airborne platform suppression package, a capability that the planning had held in reserve for exactly this contingency, consisting of a high-power jamming allocation targeted at the Simorgh's radar emission frequency rather than the ground-based systems. The Growler EEW officer received the priority code at 8:40 a.m. and began configuring the airborne platform suppression package. The configuration required the Simorgh to emit before the suppression could be precisely targeted. You cannot jam a frequency before you know what frequency to jam. The collection had characterized the Simorgh's radar emission frequency from previous observed operations. The characterization was the database from which the Growler EW officer was configuring the suppression. The characterization was correct. The suppression configuration was complete at 8:42 a.m. The Simorgh's radar activated at 8:54 a.m. as it reached its operational altitude over the Jask sector. The emission reached the Growler's passive receiver at 8:54 a.m. and 3 seconds, the propagation delay from the aircraft's position to the Growler's. The growler suppression reached the Simorgh's radar frequency at 8:54 a.m. and 11 seconds, 8 seconds after the emission was first received, 5 seconds faster than the planning had modeled for the airborne suppression configuration activation. 5 seconds faster because the EW officer had preloaded the configuration from the database characterization, rather than waiting for live emission data to confirm it. The risk of preloading was using a frequency that differed from the aircraft's actual emission, a risk the EW officer had accepted when he received the priority code, and that he had managed by using the database characterization's center frequency rather than its edges. The preload was correct. The Simorgh's radar was suppressed within 11 seconds of its activation. It had swept the Jask sector for 11 seconds in a clean electromagnetic environment before the suppression reached it. 11 seconds produced 3 sweeps. 3 sweeps in the Jask sector over a B-2 at the approach. Geometry the mission was flying produced no return above the Simorgh's detection threshold for a target at the B-2's radar cross-section profile. 3 clean sweeps, no contact. The suppression held from the 4th sweep forward. The Simorgh's radar operator, experiencing sudden jamming 11 seconds after activation in an airspace where he had been scrambled to provide coverage, reported the jamming to his ground control at 8:54 a.m. and 19 seconds. The ground control passed the report to the Jask sector controller at 8:54 a.m. and 31 seconds. The sector controller, receiving confirmation that the airborne radar he had requested as the solution to his ground-based jamming problem was itself being jammed, understood what that meant for the mission he had been trying to disrupt. He looked at his clock. He looked at his display. He transmitted a sector-wide engagement authorization for any contact above minimum threshold on any system in the sector. The authorization reached every system at 8:54 a.m. and 44 seconds. The initial point was at 9:03 a.m., 8 minutes and 16 seconds between the sector-wide engagement authorization and the weapons release window. 8 minutes and 16 seconds during which every system in the Jask sector was authorized to engage on minimum threshold returns in a heavily jammed environment. The mission commander watched the display. No system generated a minimum threshold return in those 8 minutes and 16 seconds. The jamming that had been suppressing the sector for 41 minutes had been comprehensive enough that the active fire control radars operating in degraded modes under sustained maximum suppression produced no return above minimum threshold on the actual aircraft. The sector was authorized to engage everything it could find. It could find nothing. The bay doors opened at 9:03 a.m. The GBU-57 released from the forward station. The aircraft corrected, turned to the second pass heading, and 49 seconds later, the second GBU-57 released toward the secondary guidance component assembly hall, a separate chamber within the facility whose elimination prevented the guidance production function from being reconstituted independently of the main manufacturing complex. Bay doors closed, both weapons away. The aircraft accelerated onto the egress heading. The first weapon's penetration through the Makran limestone was, as the geological survey had characterized, consistent, dense, without anomaly. The fusing algorithm ran its standard sequence against a deceleration profile that matched the model at every depth increment. The threshold was met at 53 meters, 2 meters above the design depth within the confidence interval's lower edge. 2 meters above design in well-consolidated Makran limestone transmitted overpressure to the primary production chambers at a level that the kill mechanism analysis had computed as fully effective for the integrated manufacturing equipment the chambers housed. The propulsion stage production machinery the guidance component assembly infrastructure, the quality control measurement systems, the clean room manufacturing environment for the reentry vehicle structures. All of it experienced the pressure event at 9:03 a.m. and 41 seconds. The second weapon followed 49 seconds later to the guidance component assembly hall aim point and detonated at 55 meters. Exactly at the design depth, the Makran limestone's uniformity having produced a penetration sequence without the anomalies that previous missions' geological variability had generated. Direct contact geometry. The guidance component assembly hall was eliminated comprehensively. The two seismic events that the regional monitoring network recorded at 9:03 a.m. and 9:04 a.m., separated by 49 seconds, at the same geographic coordinate and at depths consistent with underground explosive employment, were logged by the duty seismologist at the Hormuz Provincial Monitoring Station as two distinct events rather than a natural sequence. Natural seismic sequences in this formation do not produce paired events of similar magnitude at the same coordinate with a 49-second separation. He filed an anomaly report at 9:11 a.m. The Jask sector controller, who was simultaneously managing an active sector alert, a jammed airborne radar, and a sector-wide engagement authorization that had found nothing to engage, received the seismic report at 9:14 a.m. and understood the sequence of events he had been part of. He transmitted his comprehensive report to the regional command at 9:17 a.m. The report was accurate, complete, and too late. The numbers that closed the package: 11 hours and 37 minutes of flight time, 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance, penetrators employed in a 49-second sequential interval on 2 aim points within the same integrated facility, 2 minutes sector alert response time, the fastest in the series. 1 Simorgh airborne radar scrambled to defeat ground-based jamming, suppressed within 11 seconds of activation after 3 clean sweeps that produced no above-threshold contact. 5-second faster airborne suppression execution from preloaded database configuration. 8 minutes and 16 seconds of sector-wide minimum threshold engagement authorization that found nothing to engage. 1 Pantsir repositioned 1.6 kilometers from its characterized position, producing 1 unreported 28% return in a 7-second reallocation window. 0 aircraft lost. Primary production chambers eliminated. Guidance component assembly hall eliminated. The integrated sea-launched ballistic missile production capability that had been operating in the Jask coastal highlands for 11 years was gone. Doctrine without production is strategy without force. The facility beneath the Makran limestone required 11 years to build. It required 49 seconds to eliminate. The Makran limestone holds what it always held. What was built inside it no longer builds anything.